So you guys probably know this already, but I have a lot of ships in Star Trek Online, and thus I also have a lot of builds on those ships. But, you know, we all have our favorites, and there's one I always end up going back to, one I always end up playing the most, the one that's basically sort of my idea of my main character build, so to say. If you know anything about me, you probably already know what ship this is going to be on, and probably have an idea of what sort of build it's going to be. So, before I go any further, let's take a look at my Broadside Fire at Will build on the Lexington Dreadnought. Here we are, the Lexington Dreadnought Cruiser. I know it's got the Odyssey skin on it, but that's just because it's my favorite. Trust me, this is the Lexington. The Lexington has been a pretty popular ship in Star Trek Online ever since it was introduced into the C-Store through the 12th Anniversary Bundle. In fact, to this day, the Beam Overload build video I did for the ship when it was new is still the most viewed video on this channel. And while I certainly see the appeal of this ship, its popularity has always kind of surprised me given that this ship does have a 4-4 weapons layout. Ships with 4-4 weapons layouts are generally looked down upon by a lot of the community, largely because of the difficulties you run into when trying to set up a forward-facing build on such a ship. The fact that you can only equip 2 omnidirectional beams onto a ship is a big part of this issue. However, a 4-4 weapons layout does make a ship optimal for a broadside build. So instead of focusing your damage output to the front of your ship, you'll be focusing it on either side of your ship. A broadside build does have some of its own unique difficulties and limitations, but honestly, this is still my preferred way of playing the game. I've always liked large cruisers, and a broadside build really gives you the feeling of flying a big, bulky starship. And with broadsiding, you could go with either Beam Overload or Fire at Will, but again, I have chosen the more difficult path here and gone with Fire at Will for DPS. Again, this is my preferred playstyle, because Fire at Will is just more fun to me. I love the aesthetic of just being able to fire a bunch of beams in every direction. And I've said this before, I've grown very tired of single target builds. I'm tired of picking off my targets one at a time. I'd rather just shoot everything at once. Now before I dig into the actual build itself, I want to go over some of those unique downsides to broadside builds I talked about earlier, as well as some of the upsides. As I said earlier, with a broadside build, your primary firing arcs are going to be on either side of your ship rather than your forward firing arc. This means most of your weapons are going to be beam arrays because they have a firing arc that's wide enough to cover both of your sides, but there are several bridge officer abilities and consoles that only have forward facing arcs. Immolating Phaser Lance, for example, only has a 90-degree forward arc. This is a console I would normally love to use on most builds, but it's pretty much useless on a broadside build because I have no way of redirecting that damage to my sides. This is also going to be true of the Phaser Spinal Lance. Because of that forward 90-degree arc, you're not going to be able to get much use of that on this build. Your choice of torpedoes is also going to be rather limited because, again, most of them only have a 90-degree firing arc. You're probably going to want a torpedo that has at least a 180-degree firing arc, and there aren't many of those. This also means I'm probably going to be missing out on certain set bonuses, like from the Lorca's Ambition set, because there's no wide-angle version of the Dark Matter torpedo. Additionally, despite the fact that you can fit more beam arrays onto a 4-4 build than you can dual beam banks onto a 5-3 build, the dual beam banks on a 5-3 always perform better anyway. I'm guessing Cryptic's thinking is that because you have a wider firing arc, the damage should be lower because you're going to be able to hit more targets. But the end result just does not confirm that. Broadside builds never do as well as forward-facing builds, largely because of the limitations I spoke of before. That said, there are some upsides. With a forward-facing build, you're only going to be able to focus damage in your forward arc, but with a broadside build, technically all of your arcs are covered. Because while most of your damage is going to be focused on your sides, that's just because that's where all 8 of your weapons will be able to fire in the same direction at once. But beam arrays have a 250-degree arc, so your forward and aft arcs are going to be covered as well, especially if you're using Fire at Will. Because with that ability active, your beam arrays will be targeting 2 different targets randomly, and it won't matter where they are as long as they fall within that 250-degree arc. This is why I like Fire at Will so much. Not only do I have a wide amount of coverage on both of my sides, but pretty much every arc is covered in some way or another. Forward-facing builds have much less coverage in your other arcs, so when something gets beside them or behind them, the only thing they'll have to shoot at those things is usually like a couple of Omni Beams or a couple of turrets. Another nice thing with broadsiders, particularly with Fire at Will again, is that they are really good at cleaning up small enemy targets. This is really nice in TFOs like the Swarm, where you're fighting a lot of those small Herc frigates, or in anything where you're fighting the Tholians. Fire at Will is really nice for clearing out those Tholian web nodes. One more upside with broadsiders is that they are very easy to maneuver. Since most of my damage is focused to my sides, I find it's a lot easier to get my enemies into my primary firing arcs than it would be than to get them into my forward arc. Especially with large ships like the Odyssey here, which typically have pretty bad turn rates. Okay, now let's get a look into the actual build. Obviously this thing is loaded up with beam arrays. I went with Phaser here just because, I mean, it's a Federation ship, I'm a Federation character, yeah, I'm going to use Phaser. I'm still using Agony Phasers. I know Spencer's test showed they really aren't as good as we all thought they were, but they look and sound like normal TNG/post-TNG phasers, so that fits the aesthetic of this ship. Plus I already have these upgraded to Epic, and honestly, another proc really isn't going to make that much of a difference. Among the Agony Phasers is also the Terran Task Force Phaser Beam Array. The Terran Task Force weapons have always been one of the best energy weapons in the game. Normally the dual heavy cannons are best for DPS, but obviously that's not really an option here because this is a Broadside Fire at will build. Also in the front is our torpedo, which in this case is the wide-angle quantum torpedo, which can be obtained from any C-Store version of the Sovereign class. Now, there are other wide-angle torpedoes that you could also go with, like the Prolonged Photon Torpedo or the Inhibiting Chronoton Torpedo from the Gamma Reputation. But I like this one. Quantum torpedoes hit pretty hard, and plus I love the visual for it too because quantum torpedoes really fit the aesthetic for a 2409 era Starfleet ship. And in the back we've got the Trilithium Omni-Beam from the episode Beyond the Nexus. Now there's something I should really talk about when it comes to Omni-Beams and broadside builds, and that's that they're really not all that necessary. Omnidirectional beams are very important on forward-facing builds because it's the only way you can get an aft weapon to fire in the forward arc. But that's not really a concern here on a broadside build because most of our damage is already aimed at the side, and a normal beam array already has more than enough of a firing arc to reach that far. If you look at the tooltip, the beam array is doing more damage than the omnidirectional beam. Now you're probably asking, why do I even have this Omni Beam in the first place? Well, that's because of the Trilithium Omni Beam's unique ability to give me a chance to buff my energy weapon's haste. That's really the only reason to have an Omni Beam on a broadside build at all, is for a unique proc, or for a unique set bonus. There's little point in me putting a crafted Omni here as well, because it won't have any unique effects, and it won't do as much damage as the beam array here. I also like to have one Omni Beam on the build just for the sake of balance. I have 3 beam arrays in the front, and honestly, just in my head, it just feels weird to have 4 in the back. So for me, the Omni Beam in the back kind of balances out the torpedo in the front. I don't really know why, it doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it, but it fits better in my head for some reason. Maybe I'm just crazy, I don't know. But like I said earlier, the main reason an Omni Beam is here is for either a unique ability or for a set bonus. There is no reason to use a crafted Omni here. There is one change I would love to be able to make for these weapons that I'm just not able to do, and that's to replace the 2 Agony Beams in the front with a pair of narrow angle phaser beams. These are unique beam arrays that have a slightly narrower firing arc than standard beam arrays, reducing their firing arc from 250 degrees to 210. In exchange for the smaller firing arc, their damage is higher than a standard beam array. I know Spencer's had the chance to play around with these, and he said they're pretty nice. They're still not as powerful as dual beam banks, so obviously you wouldn't want to put them on a forward-facing build, but they do have a nice damage buff compared to standard beam arrays, so they would be a nice addition to a broadside build like this. Even though they do have a more narrow arc than standard beam arrays, 210 degrees is still a nice wide range, and is more than enough to cover a broadside build. Now the only reason I'd want to add 2 is because that's how many Cryptic will only let you have. They're a unique type of weapon, so they have their own unique restrictions, so you can only have 2 on any one build. Not that that matters for me, because currently I have 0 of them, because the only way to get these beam arrays is off of the Constitution 3, which is not only a promo ship, and thus very expensive, but also I really hate that ship, and I don't want to have to buy it. I'm still holding out hope that we'll get more versions of the narrow angle beams available in different ways that are easier to obtain, though of course with my luck they'll probably be Tetrion or something. The core gear is pretty much your standard setup for an energy weapon build. We've got the Intervention Protomatter Deflector from the Fleet Colony for its buffs to crit chance and crit severity, the Competitive Reputation Engine for the speed buffs, though if you don't like the speed buffs you can go with the Romulan Reputation Engine for its buff to crit severity. For the Warp Core there are a few options that I like. Right now I'm using the Plasma Integrated Warp Core from the Fleet Spire, which is always good for energy weapons. But if you've watched some of my more recent videos, you also know I've been screwing around with the Tholian Nucleating Warp Core a lot lately, just because I like its ability to drop the Tholian Warp Crystals. It's a nice ability, but it's not great in every situation. There's also the Mycelial Harmonic Warp Core from the Discovery Reputation. This one can be really nice for the 2-piece with the shield, which will give you a buff to your hull regeneration. The thing about fire at will builds is that they typically generate a lot of threat, so a lot of the enemies are going to be shooting at you. So it's really not a bad idea to incorporate some tanking methods into the build if you're struggling with survivability. The devices, again, are pretty much your usual setup. I'm not even going to go over them this time, I'm just going to list them on the screen for you guys. Now let's move on to the consoles, and the first thing you can probably notice is that I am using as many isomagnetic consoles on this thing as I possibly can. I know not all of you are into them just because of how much effort it takes to grind the advanced consoles, but man, these things have made a hell of a difference, especially on engineering-heavy cruisers like this. For a cruiser, the Lexington does have a lot of room for tactical consoles, but even upgraded to Tier 6X2, I'm only going to have room for a maximum of 7 of the Spire consoles. And even then, I'm probably going to lose one to make room for Lorca's custom fire control. But not only am I able to make room for 8 isomagnetic consoles, but I can also mix in the Protomatter Matrix Infusers from the Fleet Colony to add even more Cat 1 damage to my phasers. These also have a chance to grant a passive heal every time you activate a firing mode for your energy weapons, which feeds into what I was talking about earlier about incorporating some tanking elements into the build if you're struggling with survivability. But even if you're not struggling there, either way, this is still more damage. That said, you could still stick with vulnerability locators and or exploiters from the Fleet Spire, just fill your tactical and universal consoles up with those, and maybe mix in Lorca's as well, and then you'll have 3 open console slots which you can fill with universal consoles or whatever you want. I'll go over some other options you can use, but first let's finish up with the other consoles I'm using on this build right now. First is the DPRM off the Atlas Prototype Dreadnought, and this one is kind of a no-brainer. It's got a really nice buff to bonus damage, and its heal is also going to be really nice because, like I said earlier, Fire at Will tends to take in a lot of threats, so you're going to be taking in more damage than you might be used to, so a nice heal like this is going to be a really good panic button. We've also got the Domino off the Bajoran Interceptor. Again, this is another one that's really nice because of its bonus damage buff, plus its really nice buff to Firing Cycle Haste for my energy weapons. Next is the Flagship Tactical Computer. This is off the Endeavor Tactical Star Cruiser, as well as its Klingon and Romulan variants, and the Legendary Odyssey, and the Legendary Bortisque, and the Legendary Scimitar. This one was actually a recent addition to the build. Before I was actually just using a third Protomatter console, but I decided I wanted a bit more haste on the build, and this is a nice console for that. Not only does this give 33% firing cycle haste for your energy weapons for 15 seconds, but it'll also give plus 50% to your turn rate and flight speed during that time as well. And the really nice thing about this one is that it applies to the entire team, not just yourself. The drawback to that is that the entire team will also be locked out of this ability for a full 60 seconds after using this. So it's a really nice console, but it's really only ideal if only 1 or 2 people on the team are actually using it. So if you ever find yourself not able to activate this ability, it's probably because at least one other person on the team is also using this console. So at that point, I would probably swap in a third Protomatter console or swap in another Universal console. It's also worth noting that this console and the rest of its set were recently only usable on variations of the flagships. That's any variant of the Odyssey, Bortosk, or the Scimitar. But with the recent release of the Legendary Bortosk, this set has been unbound, so it is now usable on any ship. So if you're wanting to recreate this build on another ship, you won't have to worry about what you're going to replace the Flagship Tactical Computer with. And the last console on here is Experimental Power Redirection off of the Excelsior 2. Of course, I'm using this console on a Fire at Will build because it's basically a second Fire at Will that's even more powerful. Basically, it sets all of your beam weapons to basically flip-flop between Fire at Will 3 and Beam Overload 3. Additionally, it'll also activate its own auxiliary phaser beams, which will fire what it calls Overload at Will 3, which is basically just a really powerful Fire at Will that will target up to 4 random enemies. This ability will stay active for 15 seconds, its damage will increase as you get more kills, and it'll also give your energy weapons a damage buff, which will scale based off of the level of your engine, shield, and auxiliary power. This is a very powerful console for phaser builds, and it is the whole reason why I love the Excelsior 2. Okay, let's talk about some other options for consoles, because like I said earlier, if you're using the Spire consoles, you're going to have some free spaces open. So, if you have more of the flagship technology set, some of those consoles would be really good to mix in. Timeline Stabilizer off of the Krenum Science Vessel also gives more haste, which is pretty nice. And Adaptive Emergency Systems off the Sojourner also gives bonus damage. And by pairing those up, you'll also get the set bonuses with these consoles, the 2-piece giving some crit chance and turn rate, and the 3-piece gives you a chance to get some bonus damage and temporary hull when your shields are depleted. I probably wouldn't worry about Dampening Wave off the Yorktown, but if you really do want that 4-piece to improve the other abilities of these consoles, I wouldn't say it's a bad idea. There's also the M6 computer off of the Tier 3 Perseus Temporal Escort. It's a lower tier console, so it doesn't have any passives on it, but it is still good for bonus damage and haste. It's kind of like a budget version of the Domino. You could also go for reinforced armaments in order to get the 2-piece with the Trilithium Omni. That would give you guaranteed firing cycle haste and is rewarded from the same episode as the Omni. And to wrap up the gear, we've also got a hangar bay on this ship, so I am using the Elite Valkyrie Fighter Squadron. There really isn't any particular reason why I'm using the Valkyries for this build, I just like them. If you also like the Valkyries, then by all means use them, but if there's something else you prefer instead, then go ahead and use that. My skills are pretty much the same as they always are. For the primary specialization, I'm using Intel Officer to gain access to space flanking, and Temporal Officer for the secondary to gain access to Entropic Rider. If you prefer Strategist for your secondary, you can easily go with that. I just don't like Strategist because it doesn't have any ground skills. Next up is the Starship traits. These are my usual setup for an energy weapon build, so I'm going to go over them pretty quick. Adaptive Offense for the crit chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff. Context is for Kings, which can be a damage resistance buff or a bonus all damage buff. Fleet Coordinator for the bonus damage buff based on the number of people in the team. Even a team of 1 still counts. Independent Wingmate, which gives a 200% bonus damage to the first hangar pet that's launched, meaning only one of my 6 Valkyries will be getting that bonus damage buff. Now you'll see later in the combat log that the hangar pets didn't actually do that well, which was a little disappointing to me, so frankly this personal trait might be a little bit of a waste. Instead, I probably should have gone with something like Symbiotic Ice, which adds 6% of my beam damage as cold damage. Or if you're a tactical player, you'll want A Good Day to Die. Next is Innocuous for the reduced threat generation and a little bit of crit severity. Inspirational Leader for the chance at a stacking buff to most of my starship skills. Intel Agent Attaché to lower the cooldowns of my captain's abilities. Superior Beam Training for the bonus damage to my beam weapons. Terran Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff. Unconventional Systems to lower the cooldowns of my universal consoles. And the Boimler Effect to help lower my Bridge Officer cooldowns. In the Starship traits, first is Superior Area Denial off of the Terran Angle Strikewing Escort. Anytime I use Fire at Will or Scatter Volley, this will give both of those abilities to my pets, meaning my Valkyries will have the ability to use Scatter Volley 1. It also allows my weapons to apply a damage resistance debuff to enemies they hit, which is pretty nice with Fire at Will because since you're going to be firing on multiple enemies at the same time, you'll also be debuffing them along with that. Next is Emergency Weapon Cycle off of the Arbiter Battlecruiser, and obviously this has been part of the energy weapon meta for years now. Activating emergency power to weapons reduces my weapons power cost and increases my firing cycle haste for my energy weapons. Terran Goodbye off the Mirror Warship, which grants buffs to crit chance and accuracy every time I kill an enemy, which stacks up to 3 times. Entwined Tactical Matrices off of the Gagarin Miracle Worker Battlecruiser. Activating Fire at Will or Scatter Volley will give me a hit of Torpedo Spread 1, and activating Torpedo Spread 1 will give me Fire at Will and Scatter Volley 1. Fire at Will doesn't have a proper extension trait, so this is kind of the closest you're going to get to that. So instead of extending Fire at Will's duration, this just allows you to flip-flop between Fire at Will 3 and Fire at Will 1. The Ruin of Our Enemies off of the D7 Miracle Worker Flight Deck Carrier. Every time I defeat a foe, I'm granted a small bonus damage buff, but this thing stacks up to 100 times, so this can grow into a very powerful damage buff. Calm Before the Storm off of the Cardassian Intel Flight Deck Carrier. After you enter combat, you'll gain stacks of Calm every 2 seconds. Each stack will grant a small amount of damage resistance. Once you get to 10, that stack of Calm will be removed and replaced with a 33% buff to firing cycle haste to your energy weapons. So basically, for 20 seconds you get a damage resistance buff, and then the following 20 seconds you get a firing cycle haste buff, and just flip-flop between the two. And the last Starship trait on here is Ship of the Line off the Legendary Avenger. Activating an emergency power ability will grant a 20% buff to crit severity for 30 seconds. This ability will stack while it's active with subsequent activations of an emergency power ability, granting an additional 10% per activation. Now, based on that description, you might be wanting to stuff as many emergency power abilities onto your bridge officers as you can, but keep in mind that those abilities will also have their own shared cooldown with each other. Activating one will trigger a 15-second cooldown on any of the others. By the time the second one has already done its thing, the first one's already off cooldown, so there's really not much need to add a third one. Not that I have the room for it anyway. Also, don't use 2 of the same emergency power ability, because that will trigger a longer shared cooldown. I'm using emergency power to weapons and emergency power to engines. If I activate one, the other one will be on a 15-second cooldown. But if I use 2 seats of emergency power to weapons, then activating one will trigger a 30-second cooldown on the other. Now, before moving on, again, some other things I would have liked to do with the Starship traits. Like I said earlier, the pets actually didn't do that well in the combat log as I was hoping they would be, so I'm kind of questioning whether or not I need Superior Area Denial. Before Ship of the Line came out, I was using Calculated Broadside there, which comes off of the Excelsior 2. Its damage buff is only Cat 1, but even so, 35% to my beam weapon still isn't bad. And it reduces my threat generation by 60%, which, again, threat is going to be quite an issue on a Fire at Will build. Of course, threat generation really isn't going to make that much of a difference if I'm playing solo content, because if I'm the only person on the team, obviously enemies are going to shoot at me regardless. I'm also considering Weapons Hot Deflectors to full off the Inquiry. It works a lot like Emergency Weapon Cycle, but is instead triggered by Emergency Power to Shields. The downside is that the amount of haste you get scales with your shield power. So using Emergency Power to Shields 1 with my current power layout, I'd only get a haste buff of about 9.4%. Though of course I could get that higher thanks to EPS power transfer, but even activating those two at the same time only gets it up to 12%. This got me to looking at overpowered and overgunned, but actually after looking at it, weapons hot and deflectors to full might be the better option. Because while overpowered and overgunned does give a firing cycle haste buff of 12.5%, and reduces my weapons power cost by 15%, its duration is only a maximum of 10 seconds, and that scales with your global crit chance. Because I'm not using the Spire consoles, I'm not even getting that full 10 seconds. And while weapons hot deflectors to full doesn't have the reduced weapons power cost, it does have a duration of 30 seconds. So it is slightly less haste, but I'm going to have it for 3 times as long. I'd have to swap out emergency power to engines to use it, but honestly I'm not getting much use out of that ability anyway, so it can go. God, I can't believe I'm actually considering using emergency power to shields on a build. Now there is one other trait I would definitely pick over either of these, but again it's a case of me not having that trait because it is expensive. Thunder Run, which gives a 20% bonus damage buff to beams anytime you activate Fire at Will, Beam Overload, or Cloaking Device. It'll also increase your defense rating based on your speed and give you a buff to threat generation if you're in threatening stance, but it's mostly about the bonus damage. A 20% bonus damage buff every time I activate Fire at Will would be very nice, but this trait also comes off of the Constitution 3. I really don't want to buy that awful ship. Anyway, moving on to the reputation-based traits. First is Advanced Targeting Systems for the crit severity, Tyler's Duality for the crit chance, Precision for additional crit chance, Magnified Firepower for the bonus damage buff to my weapons, and Controlled Countermeasures to the bonus damage against controlled targets. Now for the Bridge Officer abilities. The stuff in the tactical seat is pretty straightforward. We've got Chemosite-laced weaponry to add some extra radiation damage to my weapons fire, Torpedo Spread 2 to buff my torpedo and to activate Entwined Tactical Matrices, and Fire at Will 3 because, well, it's a Fire at Will build. The other tactical seat I'm using more as an intel seat, in which I'm using Viral Impulse Burst and Ionic Turbulence, both of which are used to trigger unconventional systems. In the Engineering/Miracle Worker seat, first we've got Emergency Power to Engines. I was using this for the speed buff and to trigger Ship of the Line, but if I do end up swapping in Weapons Hot Deflectors to full, I'll be trading this for Emergency Power to Shields. Then we've got Emergency Power to Weapons 2, which is buffing my energy weapons, triggering Emergency Weapon Cycle and Ship of the Line. Narrow Sensor Bands, which gives a bonus damage buff to my energy weapons based on the distance to my target. And Mixed Armament Synergy, which will grant a bonus damage buff to the weapons types that I am not about to fire. Meaning if I activate this and fire my torpedo, all of my beams will get the bonus damage buff. And if I fire a beam after activating this, then my torpedo will get the buff. Now, normally I have Emit Unstable Warp Bubble mixed into my engineering seating for the Unconventional Systems trigger, but I had to sacrifice that for one of the emergency power abilities for the sake of Ship of the Line. Normally I don't like to give up on an Unconventional Systems trigger, but Emit Unstable Warp Bubble has one of the worst minimal cooldowns of any Bridge Officer ability in the game, meaning I'm not going to be able to use it nearly as much as something like Tractor Beam, which has a very low minimal cooldown. So I figured it wasn't that big of a deal considering how much crit severity that Ship of the Line can give. And now in the science seating, we've got Jam Targeting Sensors, Scramble Sensors, Gravity Well, and Tractor Beam. All of these are here just to trigger unconventional systems. Though Gravity Well on its own is also really nice to have just for the sake of grouping enemies together. That's another reason why I wasn't too concerned about giving up Emit Unstable Warp Bubble. I still have 6 more Uncon triggers, so yeah, it's fine. And now for the Duty Officers, again, kind of what you would expect if you've seen any of my previous videos. Some crazy expensive Borg Duty Officers, plus some crazy expensive Projectile Officers that can buff crit chance or crit severity. Since this is Fire at Will, you could get away with using the energy weapon counterparts of these guys, but honestly I'm pretty sure those are even more expensive on the exchange, so I don't know if you want to go that route. But if you're wanting to go something more budget focused, you're probably still using an Aux to Bat build, so you're going to want to fill this up with Technicians. If you want to keep emergency power to engines, you could also throw in the Emergency Con hologram. You could also throw in Vincent Kish here. Entwined Tactical Matrices only gives you Fire at Will 1, but with Vincent Kish, you have a chance to upgrade that to Fire at Will 2. It wouldn't be a huge buff, but it would still be an improvement if you can't afford some of these more expensive duty officers. Okay, let's get a look at the combat log test, then we'll show off this thing in action. For this, I did the usual portion of Ninth Roll where all the waves are warping in. For the sake of transparency, the footage behind this is not the footage from this combat log. Annoyingly, the footage of this run ended up getting corrupted, so I am unable to do anything with that. What you're seeing behind it is one of several other recordings that I took during testing. It really sucks that that footage was the one that got corrupted because it was my best run. I managed to get 429k out of this thing. I was fighting the Fakiri in this run, which they're not a particularly tough enemy, but they do have that weird half cloaking device that makes them untargetable. Usually whenever I fight the Fakiri, one of them activates that cloak and then they wander off and then I have to go chase them down and then I have to wait for the cloak to deactivate so I can do anything about it, and that screws up with my overall DPS numbers. But I definitely got lucky in this round. Another reason this is so high is because I usually end up having one death in these runs. Again, having a death is certainly going to screw with your DPS numbers, and sometimes that's just unavoidable in certain builds. And it's certainly not unavoidable in this build too, but frankly the fact that I managed to get a run without a death did surprise me. Though in my defense, some of it was just really good timing with certain abilities, like the DPRM. So it all wasn't just dumb luck, some of it was just my brain actually working properly for once. It does happen from time to time. In the combat log, we can see obviously Fire at Will 3 did the most damage, which is no surprise at all. It is a Fire at Will build. This is the backbone of the whole thing, so obviously it's going to do the best. We've got the Fire at Will 1 triggered by Entwined Tactical Matrices right below it, which did about half as much damage. This is why I really want Fire at Will to be given a proper extension trait and for its minimal cooldown to be brought back down to 15 seconds like every other firing mode. I am losing DPS because I'm having to downgrade Fire at Will down to Fire at Will 1 for literally half the duration of combat, because I have no other way of keeping the ability up consistently 100% of the time. Meanwhile, none of the other firing modes have to deal with this kind of crap. Anyway, we got 34k out of the auxiliary phaser beams on Overload 3, that's the Excelsior 2's console. Chemosight did 20k on its own, not bad for a bridge officer ability. I'm actually thinking about upgrading that to Chemosight Lace Weaponry 2. Because right now I've got Torpedo Spread 2 in that spot, and Chemosight 1 did almost twice the damage of Torpedo Spread 2. So I may as well feed further into Chemosight, because clearly that's doing better. In fact, Torpedo Spread 2 didn't even do that much better than the Torpedo Spread 1 that you get from ETM. Torp Spread 2 having done just under 12k, Torp Spread 1 did 7.5k. Now I talked about earlier about how the pets really hadn't done much damage, and you can see here the Valkyries only did 7.4k DPS. That is not a lot, and I think the big problem is I'm having trouble keeping them alive. Not only that, but I'm also not able to replace them as quickly as I normally do because I'm not using Sensor Suspension Burst, which I normally do on a ship with a hangar bay. That console comes from the Alliance carrier. So yeah, definitely going to give up on Independent Wingmate, and I'm probably going to replace SAD as well. Okay, let's get a better look at this thing in action through a Wanted patrol, and then we'll get to the outro. Oh, but before that, reminder that there is still the giveaway going on the Discord. We're giving away a pair of 100% off T6 C-Store coupons. It is for PC only. I'm sorry console players, but I don't have any coupons for console. But yeah, that'll be ending on October 19th, so you still have time to enter that if you haven't already. Just head on over to the Discord, find the giveaways channel, scroll down to the latest giveaway, and then hit the little red party horn and you'll be entered. Now, let's go watch this thing tear through Wanted. So yeah, that is my Broadside Fire at Will build on the Lexington Dreadnought. Like I said earlier, this is my favorite build. This is my preferred playstyle. This is the one I always go back to, not just because it is my favorite ship, but it is my favorite way to play the game. I do wish it was a bit better in terms of performance, just because Fire at Will has always been kind of ever since it was nerfed way back in the day, but, you know, what can you do besides complain a lot, which is what I do. So yeah, let me know what you think of the build down below in the comments. I know not everyone's into the whole isomags grind, so I did try to give some alternatives there, so let me know what you think of those as well. While you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications, and if you'd like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button to become a member, or hit the super thanks button, or find the link to the merch store in the video's description. If you're ever shopping on the Epic Game Store, be sure to use my content creator code STU1701. It doesn't cost you anything extra, but it does help me out, and I do appreciate that. That is Epic creator code STU1701. But either way, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time. Okay, let's hope they enjoy that. But first, lunch. Okay. Ah. Let's get rid of... What are you doing down here?